and we're almost ready to come back. I ran into Lan upstairs. She's pouring herself a drink. For those of you in the audience who don't know, we're married and we live in the same house.
What?
Didn't quite know
what?
I didn't quite know how to bring that up during the interview. Like, seems a little bit awkward, you know, to bring up the personal relationship, right?
That's how she knows.
There she is. There she is. I think we're back. We're in our less formal stage of the conversation with our two honored guests. You know, I have a personal relationship with both Nguyen, who is one of my mentors, and with Lan, who is my wife, you know, and so it's such a delight to be able to talk to both of you here. Also with, you know, to be here with Philip, DJ Puzzle, and all of you out there coming from all over. Some of you are regular visitors to our show, and some of you are new. So here we are. It's your opportunity out there in the audience to ask questions of our guests. And I don't know, Philip, did you already pick a question from the Q&A?
Yeah, we've got one from Duong Jang Fan. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. Maybe we can throw some Vietglish in this last part of the conversation, but they said, this conversation allows me to approach my refugee identity with serenity. Thank you. For me, fleeing Vietnam was also fleeing the Vietnamese. I fearfully tamed Vietnamese communities in my new society, Canada. Can you share your experience in dating other Vietnamese in your new country?
That's your question, Lan and Vic. No?
Honestly, yeah, we could get a little bit of the love story going on here. You know, if it's not too personal, but, you know, just putting it out there.
Okay. So when Viet spoke of a stormy, dark night, that's exactly what happened. So let's just 1996. I was more of a writer than a scholar, and I had dreams of going to New York, and I wrote poetry more often than I do now. And Viet was part of Muk Va Mau, Ink and Blood, and I was happy to be a part of this community of poets and writers. So one of our friends had put together a poetry reading in Berkeley, and I read. And Viet came up and asked me for my information to be on the list to contact. But, you know, 25 years later. So that was how we met. And I tell people also that it's faded because we came to the same refugee camp, went to California. We probably went to the same library, San Jose library, but it was destiny that we would then meet via poetry at Berkeley.
I don't know, Gian, you don't want to handle that question?
Me?
Yeah.
Oh,
On love.
I can if there's time. So my answer is something that I would like to write about someday. And I didn't get a chance to talk about this when you asked me the question about refugee experience. And this is something that I recently began to ponder. And well, it was because I left Vietnam at the age of 12. And, you know, and as I was saying, being a refugee was so busy that you didn't have time to reflect on being a refugee. And so recently I began to think about, well, what did I miss leaving Vietnam at that time, which is when you enter adolescence and dating. And so instead of beginning, you know, having ideas about romance or even thinking about dating or, you know, dreaming about whatever, Vietnamese people are super romantic. And so all of that, you know, being on a bike, on the back of a bike or a moped around, you know, Vietnam in the summer breeze and all of that, like all of those romantic ideas, I felt like I was very upset that I missed all of that I didn't get a chance to have it. And instead, what I had was learning English, dealing with racism, dealing with economic inequality. That was my adolescent experience. So I'm angry for my younger self now. You know, I didn't think about it then because, of course, you just didn't have time. And so, you know, I wonder what it would have been like to, because, you know, thinking about the teen years that I never had, and for the Vietnamese romantic selves that I did never experience. And of course, I'm romanticizing everything, but that is the point, right? The point was that I didn't have that experience, and that being a refugee is also about who we might have been, right? Rather than who we were, it's just like the who we might have been, and how do we calibrate, adjust, and can we, you know, I don't know what it would be like to be in a household where you speak Vietnamese to your partner, and the very intimate ways that Vietnamese communicate with each other, like, you know, em and an and cưng and mình and all of those words that gets translated to I and you, you know, and I just like it's not enough. So to me, that's like a loss.
Awesome. We have a question from, I'm sorry, Philip, you got to take over. I totally lost my voice.
Yeah, I was just gonna, well, before we get into this question from Luna, who's asking about anti-Blackness, I would just say, there's something about like going into like ABC, like in Little Saigon, or like the ABC supermarket, and like everyone calls you a cưng, or like a cuddle. Like it's just so, like, and Viet, you wrote about this too, right? Like con ơi ba nè, right? And your article about Thanksgiving, like there are some words that are like untranslatable, and they just end up being like you and I. So like, I think we're gonna get into language, but throwing that out there, if you haven't been called a cuddle, it's like a life-changing experience. Luna Chung asks how, and I guess we're going like from past to present, right, into the contemporary. How do we address the question of anti-Blackness within a global refugee discourse? They're thinking of the refugee situation in Ukraine, where the dominant image is of Anglo-Ukrainian individuals, yet there are so many videos circulating of Black and brown folks not being able to leave Ukraine, or even the treatment of Black Vietnamese individuals within the Vietnamese American refugee community. It's a big one, and it's definitely a tonal shift from where we were at, but kind of hopping straight into it. I'll pass it to you, Lan, first.
Okay, well, so this is an important question, and thank you so much, Luna. We wrote this book during the pandemic, during Trump's horrifying regime, and then also after George Floyd. All of those events really triggered us, and very much me actually, to think about how we could better form a community of care that is inclusive, that cannot be homophobic, anti-Black, that is respectful of all of our differences, and as inclusive as possible. So it is an imagination, it's an act of imagination to think outside of those boundaries. But so anti-Blackness was something that really fueled my thinking about how we need to address the Vietnamese American community too. And so, for example, in the prologue, I wrote it, and I also wrote the ending. And why that mattered to me was because I was so angry at seeing all these, the litany of Black suffering, in terms of the images that we were seeing, in terms of the injustice that was ever being recycled. And I wanted to pull that thread through the writing, and I was inspired by Black thinkers like Saidiya Hartman and Christine Sharp, in terms of On Beauty or In the Wake. And so those were the kinds of feminist lineages I think that we were drawing upon, as well as Indigenous writings, especially Indigenous feminist writings, to think of other worlds. So how do we deal with anti-Blackness within our within the Vietnamese American community? And it is a problem that I have no solution for, but I know that I have a lot of hope for the second generation who are willing to have these kinds of conversations with parents, with family, with friends about how harmful their behavior is, their language, the ways in which we talk to one another about other people or about others inside the home and outside the home. I take so much inspiration from the kind of courage that this next generation wants to do in terms of speaking about these larger issues of race and racism in the US. I'm inspired by the ways that we can think across community spaces. And so if anything, anti-Blackness is something that we have tried to, that has really motivated me to write this book, but then other books as well. But it has also made me really appreciate younger folks are, again, tackling these issues head on. So thanks, Luna, for the question. I'm not sure if I was able to answer it in the way in which you probably needed it to be answered. But Yen, if you have any responses.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with a lot of what you said. In San Diego, so I want to just offer that there are vibrant, active Black refugee communities in San Diego, and who are doing really great work that we don't hear much about, because when we think about Black refugees, we don't think of them as individuals, organizations who have created amazing infrastructure for themselves. So just to also be mindful that Black refugees are also rebuilding and giving us new ways to imagine how to be in this country.
Thanks y'all for that. Switching it up a little bit, especially since this Departures was written and the idea was initiated during the pandemic. We have a question from Viet Luong. They are from Vienna, Austria, and they don't have many Vietnamese people here. They're in Austria. So their question is, how big is your community, up to your interpretation? And do you meet each other also sometimes, or is it just online? The project really inspires them. So if y'all could kind of speak to diasporic connections, how you stay connected, how you have been able to stay connected through the pandemic or otherwise, that would be awesome.
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
I'm also interpreting it as there aren't that many Vietnamese diasporic people in Austria, right? And so maybe a little bit more difficult to form a physical Vietnamese community there versus being in the paradise of California, where there's literally hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese people. So, we're sort of privileged in California and in certain other places where there's a significant diasporic community. So when you're faced with a situation, and I think maybe it's Viet Ha, when you're faced with a situation where there's not as much of a physical community, what are some possibilities for this collective action or community building that other Vietnamese diasporics might be able to undertake when they're not so fortunate as to live in California or places like it?
Yeah, I also want to bring it back to Chị Yên first, maybe, because earlier you had also mentioned like you were in California in time before there was like Paris, Bangai, Thuy Nga, or Little Saigon. So
yes, I remember that we used to drive as long as it took to find other Vietnamese people, and we went to a concert that was like 2 hours away. But now, of course, we don't do that anymore because there's so many opportunities. But at that time, wherever there were Vietnamese people, we go there, so yes. So I forgot the question, but just wanted to share that there are multiple experiences of being Vietnamese. And if I may share another story, whenever I go somewhere, I try to find Vietnamese people. And I was in this little Canadian town that borders Michigan. And there was a Vietnamese restaurant. So I went, and the Vietnamese owner was so happy to see us. I brought my children at that time and my husband, and they, he would say, what do you want to eat? The kids, and he would just like cook for them. It was like so much love and care. And then he was telling me, you have to wait because there are Vietnamese people coming from Michigan tonight that you need to meet. And I'm thinking, I'm from California. I see Vietnamese people all the time. But for him, it was so meaningful, and that it was something that I needed to wait for. So I completely understand the different ways that we in the diaspora experience being Vietnamese or experience community.
Yeah, so from an academic point of view, because Yen and I and the collective in general, we were able to get this grant that allowed us to organize these wonderful gatherings that were part academic and part community building. And that was just an important objective for us to create and build community. So how we did that was we invited everyone to come who works with refugees or who identifies as refugees. And we had, like, for example, an amazing event in San Diego that Yen had organized, where we had parents and teachers talk to each other and students. And it was transformative because we were able to see what we needed from each other. And it was a space of joy as well. There was dancing, there was food, there was this deep sense of communal belonging. And that's one way in the past, I would say 5 years, that we've had these really meaningful gatherings across many different spaces and across many different communities. And that's what really inspired us to write the book as well. The dedication is for all of those who have been refugees and to our communities, because in fact, it's the communities who we work with that inspire us to think about these issues, and to think about, to allow us to imagine other worlds, other ways of being.
Yeah, I think it's also important. Lan, maybe you can put the website for our collective website. We also, our collective members are from other refugee communities, not only Vietnamese. So we have also people who work in Palestine, who work on, Cambodia, the Hmong community, Black refugees, and so on. So please check out our website, and we have interactive ways for you to engage. And yeah, please also email us if you can put that into the email address, and we'll,
Yeah, definitely. This can be a way for folks who may be inspired by this conversation to reach out and connect with other like-minded Viet folks, right? As well as a way to inspire people to go out and find different ways to support and help refugees. We have a couple of questions. One from Nguyen, who asked, since only 1% of refugees get resettled to another country, such as the United States, what do you think are some of the best ways that we can support the 99% that will never get resettled? As well as one from Nguyen, who speaks about working with refugee students who are mainly from Afghanistan. And she's looking for ways to get their stories out there, and an anthology published that help raise funds for their education. So on supporting refugees through through this community building, whether Vietnamese or not, could y'all both speak to those efforts? Maybe we'll start with Ian.
Yes, so I think that, yeah, it is, and as we mentioned earlier, the number of refugees has only increased. And of course, that's direct correlation to the escalation of military violence across the world, as well as ecological disaster that we, from capitalist practices. So it feels really overwhelming for us who are invested in refugee livelihood and lives. So I think what we do foremost is to provide, as Lan said earlier, what we feel that we can do and actively doing is providing new vocabulary, new ways of thinking about refugees, because refugee policies emerge from the ways in which refugees are conceptualized and dehumanized. And if we, so for us to be able to push back against those debilitating images and the violent language is really key to having new practices. And we think about and in terms of the question about education, about how to address like new students from Afghanistan. It's ongoing, right? Because we have new waves of refugees coming all the time. And so we have some concrete projects. Just in July, in Merced, our colleague Ma Vang headed called the Refugee Teaching Institute, where we worked with teachers, local teachers in Merced, to incorporate into their curriculum refugees-based materials. So that's a concrete way of addressing issues that have to do with refugee education. So it's not only about teaching refugees, but also refugee teaching. So so I think that we clearly see the many issues that exist, and we engage and as much as we can. Yeah.
Yes, and on that segueing, we have a question from Jin To, and I just want to apologize to all the folks in the audience who submitted questions. We might not be able to get to all of your questions, but we will, do our best to try and honestly email us after. We can forward your questions and get some answers. But Jin To asks, "It's so lovely to see Viet female scholars in action." Word. I came across both of your names and Viet's as an undergrad. And it feels surreal to be here getting to know your work more. Can you both talk a little bit about your teaching, being a professor/scholar, having Viet students who look up to you, and what it's like, what your experience has been mentoring them? Pass it to you, Lan.
That's so nice. Yeah, I take mentoring really seriously because exactly that. I run into a lot of Vietnamese American students who see me in the classroom, and I see that as a form of political activism in and of itself. And I try to be as open about how I got here as much as possible, so that they could, follow a trajectory if they go into academia or other pathways, to understand that there are so many pitfalls. But one of the ways in which I survived or continue to survive academia is through my mentors like Nguyen and Viet, who has been, so central in my life, in my professional life as well. So it's that kind of relationship that I think needs to be cultivated early on as a student, and where I think I can speak for many in the room who are academics. We're always open to talking to students, and especially Vietnamese American students, just because we identify with so much of your background, and it's always fun to see how similar your lives are, at least with mine. So Yes, I really enjoy being a mentor and a teacher to students. The students energize me and give me hope and inspire me as a scholar.
Yeah, I echo all of that. And I remember in one class, I was sharing with the students, like, it is, to me, it probably was one of the first times where Vietnamese students get to learn about Vietnamese people from a Vietnamese professor, because of course I'm older than Lang and Vic. And so yeah, just marking that was important, because of course I didn't have that. And it took a long time to have the second generation being and having the time and space to even take a class in ethnic studies on Vietnamese. And so I wanted to mark that moment for the students, that we were doing something very significant.
Maybe one final question. I'll try to like blend these two together from Dan Chung and Johnny Nguyen. And also I think it's cool because this particular episode is being filmed like in between two New Years, right? We have Viet Nguyen Dan coming up. We just had the New Year. Trying to put like Bao some good karma, right? But Johnny mentions the reframing of refugees as intentional beings versus, say, the flattened images of helplessness commonplace in the media. He's asking about different healing strategies, and if y'all could speak more to this, as well as other spaces for epistemological sites for these types of strategies on healing. And then Dan, and similarly related, has a question about different ways, methods that refugees employ to heal that are productive as opposed to destructive. Yeah, earlier we talked about, like, I think it was Lan, you talked about like trauma porn and like alluded to trauma bonding, right? And there's maybe a flip side to that. So I'll pass it to you first.
Yeah, well, so some of the things that we talk about when the collective comes together is especially the kinds of spiritualities, healing practices that we bring from the countries from where we originate. And these kinds of knowledges or spiritual knowledges are not always understood as legitimate or rational. And we wanted to eventually do a conference or a kind of gathering where we talk about these different healing and spiritual practices that we bring, and the cosmologies that we bring to our places of settlement and resettlement, and how we could use those as strategies to heal, not just by ourselves, as again, Western cultures especially want us to do, but together, again, as a collective, because those traumas are not only intergenerational, but they're also, passed through different cultures and different communities.
Yeah, if you go on our website, there are different ways to engage. That we have, for example, an interactive site link where you can upload your own work in literature, in art, and I think the cultural aspects of what we do really are very healing, because it allows different different parts of yourself to be engaged without having to necessarily use words only or in an academic sense, but so writing poetry, creating art, music, and so on is really important. But I also just want to say on a personal note that it is important to have community. To me, that's the most healing aspect of practice. And it wasn't until we created this collective, now there are 9 members, and we were sitting around one time, and I just had to say that I didn't realize that I needed this community until I had it. And I didn't realize again that it was being a refugee was something very specific, right? Because we have so many other ways to express racism, ourselves as racialized persons or as economically dispossessed people, or working class and first generation. We have all of those terms, but I never knew that I didn't have a vocabulary to talk about being a refugee with other people. I didn't have a place to tell people that I really minded leaving Vietnam at 12 when I didn't get to experience romance. I didn't know that that was a thing until we were together. And so just the act which anyone can do, which is just to talk to each other, make time to be together, is a really healing process. You don't need to do more than that, right? It is very possible and available for you.
It's a good note to end on, a positive note. I'm not good at being positive, so I'm glad we ended on healing. And healing, as I think we've implied, it's both individual, but it's also collective. And both those things are necessary. We all have to do our own work for our own individual issues, but we also need to build communities and collectives. We've heard about the Critical Refugee Studies Collective tonight, but this show is made possible by the collective of the Diasporic Vietnamese Artist Network, which was born out of Mao, which was the collective that brought me to organize a poetry reading on a dark and stormy night in Oakland in 1995, which is where Lan Duong, this beautiful stranger, showed up. And hey, here we are so many years later, right? That's the power of love.
And Vietnamese love in particular.
Power of community.
Yes. And from that, we produced 2 children to continue the Vietnamese story. All right. So that's an optimistic note to end on. You don't have to reproduce. You can do whatever. You don't have to be heterosexual. You can do whatever. But individual and collective healing, so crucial. If the communities aren't out there for you, we're there. But you should build your own communities in your own places, whether it's virtual or in person. I just want to thank again, Lan and Nguyen for being with us tonight, all of you as well, for sharing your time in our space and for sharing your questions. Thank you to Philip for being my co-host. Thank you to DJ Puzzle for keeping us moving all the way out.